Okay, well, why don't we start? I'd like to thank everybody for being here. This is great. I think we get a wonderful group, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Let me put this in a little bit of context in what's happened in the last two sessions. What we really wanted to do was be able to understand the transition between large language models that everyone talks about, but I think there's certain issues that we're seeing is that they're not getting the same level of improvement with the successive generations. So there's certain issues around explainability, transparency. There's what is the business case for them right now? How do they make money? And then also the fact that they're enormously consumptive of energy and energy resources. And so part of that recognition, I think, is in the broader communities of people moving over to agentic architectures. And part of that mentality is how to automate basically current workflow processes. So you see certain roles and tasks being automated, and then you may have specializations in the supervisor roles. But there is the discussion that we've had in the last two sessions, in which Andrew did an excellent job presenting, is you're moving into a new kind of model of based upon really science-based principles of what it is to be intelligent, what is it to be alive, what is to be autonomous, each thing with its own agency. So we have a new sense of agency that's coming in, that of fully autonomous agents, which is very different than what we have right now. And I think that everyone would recognize that the ability to automate the cognitive processes, and we're seeing this, is not just a 10x improvement, it can be 1,000x improvement. And then when you put these different things together, you're getting a whole different kind of organization. We're in a new era that we've never been in before. And I think our reflex is to say, well, we have to have people in the loop. But when we think about building new kinds of institutions, the idea of an institution and a rule of law is that they're above the individual. You actually build something that people have roles that they're supposed to play within that context that mirror the intentions of the institution. But now we're creating a whole class of agents, I would argue, and this is part of a whole discussion here, that actually can embody and by design a certain institutional perspective and scale that way. Um, and that has real implications because what's the business case for that? What's the social contract? With people are saying, what happens to employees? And I was just mentioned earlier that I was listening to a piece by Peter Diamandis when he talks about his moonshots and his abundant society, and saying that when you really have exponential change, you do it outside the organization. You may have a special group that is just dedicated to that. This does not reports to the CEO or whatever, but they're not part of the normal organization. And I think this is the case what we have here, but it's even more fundamental than that. It's not like you're developing a new product, you're developing a new kind of enterprise. And I think where this so there are some challenges at the legacy level, and I think, but on the concept of how to deal with a new way of addressing climate change and biofinance, it's sort of a green field of how to create a new kind of economy on a bench. So it actually creates a lot of opportunity. So we're going to have certain optimism around that. But it is a big change. So having sort of laid that groundwork, what I'd like to do is begin with Simon, if you could begin, because you've been doing some work on AI risk. You've been writing just recently on these issues from the enterprise perspective, and you can take it in direction that you feel comfortable with. But I think it'd be good to inform our group around that. And then Andrew, you can follow up on that because Deloitte just came out with a recent piece as well. Um, and then I think then we would want to go into the discussion of so that when you look at a sort of a tabula rasa, creating a green field for creating a new kind of organization, how do you scale that? And Matt and Suzanne, you've been thinking a lot about that. And John, have you ever think about the ethical issues from the IEEE perspective? And Bill, you're the wise man here, having built big companies in the U.S., in China, and actually being very much involved in new notions of currency. So I think we have a really a wonderful combination of people here. So
Yeah, so
Simon,
shall I kick off? Yeah. So I think there's two tales of AI today. One is about, which is being, the first one is being sold by the technology companies, saying we can augment workers to enable them to be more productive. And we're not about replacing them, we're about augmenting them. So they don't have to do the routine, dull tasks, they can be more creative and strategic. Then you have the other tale, which is probably from the CFO point of view, which is, if the AI is doing a lot of the tasks that these full-time equivalents are doing, maybe we don't need so many of them. Maybe we can reduce headcount. We can automate in new ways, like we've automated in the past with other technologies. But I think there's missing a third tale, which John, you alluded to, which is that when you have agentic AI, when you have AI agents that can actually undertake the whole task end to end and can collaborate with each other and can innovate, then it changes the whole notion of a firm because suddenly you have the biological workers, the human workers, and they are always, there's a finite number of them and they cost quite a lot of money. But then in principle, you can have the synthetic workers, the digital workers, and in theory, there is a infinite number of them. So how does that change the notion of a firm, which always or often is constrained in its growth by the number of people it has to do tasks? And I think that's the bit that people haven't fully grasped. And what I'd like to just share was one story in terms of demonstrating that the future's already here, but it's not evenly distributed. So I published a case study on LinkedIn recently, which was a small insurance company in Europe. And for all kinds of various reasons, they decided to replace the entire operations team with robots. So not just augmenting the existing team or adding in some people to help the existing employees, replace them entirely. And this is a diverse team of knowledge workers who are paid middle class or upper middle class salaries, and doing different functions. So underwriting functions, IT, claims, etc., etc. They were entirely replaced by robots, and there was a manager robot put in charge of them, and they were given avatars, and they all communicated on Slack, and they discussed what they needed to do, and they shared ideas, and the manager told them to change things. And there was one human at the top who, I'll come back to that in a second, who was just overseeing things. But this team, because they didn't need to travel to work, sleep, take time off to have lunch, they achieved a performance that the human teams never got anywhere near because they constantly were to the task that they were given, they were working incredibly effectively to achieve that task. Now, they achieved it with unethical methods because they had no guidance. They were just task directed. And so the human at the top had to put in place some ethical guidelines to say, as an insurance company, we can't not pay out claims. We can't have near zero loss ratios. The regulator will will look at what we do, and if we have to lower our profits. But it's a great example of what I don't believe people recognize is even possible today. And this case study was done last year with tools that are now out of date already. And so when I published that, I got a lot of feedback saying, you've made it up, it's not true, it's nonsense. But it is. In the hands of the people who can create these systems, we suddenly have new power or new capability that we hadn't really appreciated the implications of. So I just want to maybe share that as a starting point for our discussion. And I just end by saying, so I believe there's a spectrum of what we can do with AI today, and particularly with agentic AI as it gets even more powerful. And at the moment, most firms are focused on very simple things on one end, but they can also do the more sophisticated things like I've just mentioned. They don't quite realize that that is possible today.
That's excellent. Thank you. So, Andrew,
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
yeah, this is right in your bailiwick.
yeah. Well, listen, I mean, I think that's a great setup for a conversation that can. I'd love to tell you just a tiny bit about our state of generative AI in the enterprise and what we see actually happening. I think it attaches to it flows from what Simon's talking about, but also puts it in a kind of light of like what's possible, the gap between what's possible and what's mostly happening right now. And I think that for me opens out into an interesting conversation about the system around these technical possibilities and the way they may shape or inflect them in directions that might be different than the ones that we hope for. I don't mean to say that pessimistically. I just want to be realistic. So, you know, we see a lot of enterprise adoption. And as you'd expect, I mean, a tremendous amount of excitement, some say hype, but this is a moment of enormous commitment, experimentation, investment, and deployment. And in our, some of our most recent studies where we're out talking to both, CTOs, CIOs, people actually running these deployments, developing these experiments, actually seeing what they produce. We're also talking to CSOs, CFOs, CEOs about their needs and, kind of really integrating into the enterprise. We're certainly seeing some things that are good to know in terms of anchors, right? There's this improved efficiency and productivity, cost reduction. Those are actually the most common things that people are looking for right now. So it's very practical. And I mean, we also see an interest in increased innovation, improved products and services, enhanced customer relationships. But like the things that Simon is setting out here and the things that John, you and I have talked about in the past are still some more exotic compared to what we see actually in the market a lot right now. So I think it's important to note that we are really in pretty early days. And we're also seeing in our conversations with enterprise leaders deploying these technologies that generative AI efforts are still kind of at kind of proof of concept stage. So as much energy as we've seen in, as much investment as we've seen in, the large majority of respondents, at least that we're talking to in large scale enterprise, say their organizations moved, a minority of their experiments really fully into production. We're seeing about 30% or fewer of generative AI experiments are fully into production. Now, you and I probably both know that moving 30%, that may sound like a small number compared to 80%, but it's actually a sign of success, right? People are experimenting and identifying what's working and what's not. But my first sort of major point is it is early days. A lot of the actual use cases that we're seeing are about sort of standard business problems today. And I think we have a ways to go before we actually start to see the full potential of a true agentic revolution, although I think that could happen faster than people think.
Yeah.
The second thing I want to say, and this may sound obvious, but I think its implications are really, for the task at hand, I think the implications could be profound. And that is these technical systems are really embedded in these pre-existing economic systems and social systems that shape not only their initial possibilities, but their evolution. And we know this from, longstanding research in science and technology studies. The technologies don't necessarily follow the intents of the people who created them or deployed them. They evolve. They evolve and use through kind of continuous interaction with these pre-existing systems. And those systems are also evolving. So you said, to my ears, an important word about where the green fields are. I would counter or at least challenge us to imagine what if there are no true green fields, but just degrees of brown fields, and so that we need to understand the boundaries of the relevant system into which these technologies are being introduced and understand, so what are the constraints that are going to shape the new possibilities? And that's because as we know, these complex systems, they have these important stabilizing properties. I've been thinking again recently about Stafford Beer's work on viable systems and the viable systems model. I think this is also, by the way, relevant to Chris Field's work, and I know, John, you've featured that. But on maintaining order in a changing environment, right? The systems in which these biofirms operate are going to have their own stabilizing system. So how do we account for and accommodate those stabilizing systems, which are necessary, but will feel like they're slowing us down, all the while still nudging the system toward desired ends. And maybe let me leave it there and allow others to jump in.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Okay, Matt, you want to you want to jump in from your perspective?
Sure, sure. Thanks, John. And I like this transition from greenfields because the work we do at Metabolic, we're coming at this from a much different angle, which is about global sustainability and how AI and humans interact as we try to find some equilibrium within planetary boundaries. So we like to say you shouldn't be developing on any greenfields, really, ever. Only brownfield. Let's keep nature as it is. Okay, so with that, I'll just start by saying, we've been playing around with this idea we call the missing trillions, which if you look just at climate finance, in 2023, we spent 1.8 trillion globally on this. Okay, we need 4.5. And although that's been growing exponentially, that's a big gap, right? And that's just one planetary boundary. We're not talking nature, we're not talking nitrogen, phosphorus, anything, okay? So we ran all these events. We had COP and Dubai and San Francisco, Climate Week London, Climate Week New York, the WEF, all this stuff. The same questions. What barriers, what obstacles, your classic systems thinking approach. And the truth is, we all know the problems, right? And so the risk return frontier, there's no money or there's no projects, whatever it is, the truth is that we need trillions of dollars to address these risks, and we need them fast, and the systems aren't allocating them right now, right? So when you look at the philanthropy system, the nonprofit, the governments, it's all about impact metrics. But these impact metrics are midpoints. There's no definition of what the actual outcome is, right? And so often these metrics not only don't define an outcome, but they don't actually define a context. So we saved 8,000 trees. That's 10,000 cars off the road. Great. But what's the goal-seeking behavior? Well, we've kind of done something like net zero, but that doesn't describe like what is the end state. So most of the debate around the climate finance movement is how do we get the money and how do we get the stakeholders to the table? The question that we now are starting to try to understand as a movement is if we had all that money, how would we allocate? Where would we get the solution sets? What observations would we look at? What does a regenerated world mean when we're successful? And how can we orchestrate these thousands, millions of organizations and actors to test all of these solutions in a coordinated way? So active inference, especially the paper that was presented on renormalizing generalized models earlier in the symposium, help solve that problem, right? And the key is how do you get all of where do you identify the projects that need to be done, whether that's project finance, venture, SME scaling, corporate investment, offtake, all the different types of assets to create new value chains in equitable ways. So agentic AI is very interesting for that. And it's interesting because the whole work that we do, and I think a lot of the very sophisticated thinkers in the environmental movement, it's always been about systems thinking, right? Which of course started from first principles of system dynamics and electrical processing, right? And then, we had the Club of Rome, the limits to growth. And then suddenly the world for the first time saw a system simulation and realized these problems. We started, Danella's 12 leverage points to intervene in a system, right? But I guess what my current understanding is that systems thinking was a rough approximation of what active inference was. It was incomplete because it lacked some of the core first principles that define this modeling framework. But now we can basically use this to help break free from some of these profit-driven optimization paradigms and add additional goal-seeking behaviors. And I think could arguably, from a conventional sense, meet the traditional return requirements, but from the true innovative sense, largely eliminate the need for all of these actors entirely when we think about a full global deployment of these. So I think as we think about this complex optimization, you're like, 9 planetary boundaries, hundreds of thousands of different potential actions, the observations, the incompleteness of a lot of this data, the ambiguity of observing it, right? That's where I get very interested. And then the question becomes, how do you actually apply AI to a bioregion, make it adaptable and equitable so that you can actually bridge local knowledge, global knowledge, which is in international development, capacity building, technical assistance. None of this stuff is being done in a coordinated way to have the full transfer locally and globally. And so I think the nested modeling paradigm, especially the recent kind of, and again, I'm still, like most people, I think in this room, trying to understand that paper that came out 2 weeks ago. But the way that the state spaces are articulated and allow us to basically, with super incomplete solutions at different levels, right? A local farm, a city, a county, a bioregion, a state, you can have these fragmented information and actually start to understand. The question, I think, really becomes, how do you get the humans to say yes to do these things? What do you do if you want to say no? How do you make sure that we don't destroy all of this beautiful qualitative wisdom storytelling and keep people really motivated as the whole concept of the last 150 years economy just kind of really dissolves and transforms into something totally different. So I was going to talk a little bit about tipping points and nonlinear systems, but I just will end by saying, we might have crossed tipping points already, right? So we need to consider those extreme edge cases in some of these matrices, right? So my interest is, how do you really amplify the real tipping point tails of the distributions? But moreover, I think it's a really good solution. I think it's a very fast solution, and I really appreciated the acknowledgement by Dr. Friston about how, look, maybe we don't need all these data centers with nuclear reactors next to them if we have simpler models that really mirror how the brain has evolved over billions of years to process and understand information and ultimately create the thriving natural world that we live in. So I'll pause there, and I'm really looking forward to more of the discussion with the panelists.
Susanna, do you want to follow up the work that you're doing in bioregional finance and the tradition that you're coming from, and the idea of the commons? And one of the things we talked about was how this approach can be a way of giving agency to nature and to different species, and actually being able to achieve forms of collective action at scale, and dealing with a lot of the problems that were identified in Eleanor Ostrom's work.
Yes, thank you, John, for inviting me onto this panel. I believe I'm the least technical person here, so perhaps I'm bringing a different kind of perspective. As Matt and I have been discussing how active inference modeling could be supportive for the bioregional movement, it's helping me understand. Well, I'm going to actually rewind a little bit. I think what you said about humans being out of the equation in this process is interesting, because I think we have to equalize human, or maybe help humans remember that we are not superior to nature, and allow nature to play a bigger role in our society, in our economy, in our policies, etc. And so, yeah, I think in terms of our current events, with climate changing as rapidly as it is, and lots of destabilization, people feeling out of control, not having agency over what's happening, it's really urgent. The times are urgent for us to hyper-localize action, and for humans to create more resilient systems with nature. And I think that is done through decentralization. I think, Web3 technology and these developments in AI can really support and enhance the harmonization process of humans and nature, which I believe is fundamentally part of the root cause of many of the conflicts that exist today. A lot of my work is really oriented around how to create more peace in the world, whether it's globally speaking, or with each other in our communities and families, or within ourselves. And at the root is this perceived separation story between humans and nature and spirit. I'm curious, I've been in an inquiry around how technology can enhance that connection or destroy that connection. And I think if AI is going to be developing at the rapid rate as it is, we're at this critical juncture that machines need to harmonize and mimic these natural intelligences for society to operate more in sync and in harmony with each other. And so bioregionalism is a longer arc that I'm working towards in terms of like, massive systems change, thinking 50, 10, 100 years out. But speaking in the next, year or two, really creating these tangible models for how bioregional governance can work at a local and continental and planetary scale. Starting here in the Northeast, where I'm based, and implementing a bioregional hub and identifying the specific interventions that we need to make in order to achieve a very specific outcome of what a successful bioregional hub would look like, and exploring how active inference modeling can be supportive in that process. And so I'm very curious to learn from all of you in how we can do that. But yeah, there's Johan Galtung. I'm not sure if you're all familiar. He's a father of peace education, Norwegian sociologist, and he speaks a lot about positive peace versus negative peace. And negative peace is the absence of a conflict, whereas positive peace is creating the conditions for peace to be possible. And so, I believe one of the root causes is this notion of resource scarcity and how we can create a world in which we're living in resource abundance, and that can be done through coordination and information systems being decentralized, and people sharing through a common pool that's evenly distributed. As was mentioned before, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm very curious about, John, why you invited me onto this panel and what you see. Yeah.
Let me answer that. I mean, I think that just what you were articulating is very important. And I think that the core of the whole active inference model is based upon a living nature. That is a first principle of it. I mean, and so we talk about AI as artificial intelligence, and I go way back to what old AI was, machines and mechanical. But actually, when you think of intelligence, is very intimately related to how something stays alive within certain constraints and being made predictions around that. And that's a fundamental process that then recognizes value in a different way. And an extent to which you're able to increase the capacity of something to live, that is a demonstrable value. And that, to me, that becomes the basis of a new kind of economy. So it's not something that's imposed. It's not something that's trying to do an offset. It's actually a different set of core principles. And so a lot of the work that you're doing and you're articulating is very much a complement to the core principles that we'll be discussing right now. And we'll get into more detail about that, and certainly have a cross conversation around that and take questions. But I know someone who's really thought a lot about this, and we've had conversations with Bill Melton on this. And Bill, and he brings a lot of experience in building big companies and variety of companies, but also doing it with a social intent. And Bill, can you provide your perspective on this?
Okay, sure. Many decades ago, more than I can remember, I was a beginning PhD student in neurophysiology And as all beginning students had many theories about life and the world, but pretty soon became frustrated with the slowness that the academic world was moving. And then on my way to class, I had a life-changing experience. I met my first computer and fell immediately in love, and then turned from that experience into a lifelong entrepreneur. And immediately, many questions started to arise, one of which was simply stated, as a startup company, you have no money, you have no experience, you have no customers. But we know statistically that startup companies grow much faster than mature companies that have money, that have customers, that have experience. What's going on there? There's something really strange happening. And I think the conclusion is that a distributed structure, as opposed to a centralized structure, is much less wasteful in its use of intelligence. In other words, no matter how smart the CEO or the top management of any company is, most decisions stop when they get close to the headquarters because you have to think about them and you have finite brain power around the headquarters. So then, as a smart, young, hopefully entrepreneurial guy, I said, all right, the world, the business world, is actually a better laboratory for me than an academic laboratory. Because if my theories are right, then I'm going to be more efficient, more competitive, and I will get paid in US dollars as opposed to just getting maybe another grant. So that was the direction I went. And I think another very early conclusion is I look at all organizations as organisms, as forms of life. And to try to understand an organization without seeing it as a life form is to miss most of what's going on. So with that mindset, it wasn't too long before I strayed into the area of the Santa Fe Institute. And the Santa Fe Institute, as you all know, has lots of people that play around with these questions of the origins of life. How did life start? How does life grow? And it pretty quickly became clear there were a couple of models that they talked about all the time that I found very, very impressive. It started out with the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, where you have this circle of individual little spaces that take care of themselves, and each space is largely autonomous. And then that space will pass on. It'll take certain inputs from something upstream, and it'll pass something on downstream. And it goes not in a pyramidal structure, but in a circular structure. So I said, aha, what happens to parasites? Well, parasites continue to consume all that is their host, and soon they have pronounced their own death. However, a symbiotic Krebs cycle organism more or less can be eternal. And so I said, that's interesting. So now let's start looking at different life forms. Yes, we can look at a human or a mammalian kind of a life form. We can also look at plant life form as quite different. We can look at spores and sporing and as a life form. We can look at mycelium networks and see how do they survive. And you start comparing the economies of these different life forms, and you get a lot of ideas as to kind of how you should structure a company or an organization or an organism of people. So that's the overall mindset that I bring to these kinds of discussions. And certainly I find just an infinite number of parallels between the kinds of things that John and Dr. Friston and so on put together between sort of my examination of life forms and see how we can apply those to human organizations. I think one of the challenges in looking at life forms, particularly life forms, is this problem of capture. In other words, as quickly as we start out with a pyramidal life form, the objective of the top of the pyramid is capture control. And as quick as you capture control, you essentially end up with a parasite, and you end up eventually with the parasitic death. So if you're going to look at the energy flow within these different life forms, the question is, okay, how do I avoid capture? And certainly just currency and money are great sort of metrics of energy flow. And obviously that's how business operates. But what we don't really appreciate often enough, it's not just a matter of creating value, therefore creating currency. It's a matter of how do you control the flow of that currency? And by controlling the flow of that currency, either with a model that is more of a Krebs cycle or a citric acid cycle, a circular cycle, as opposed to a pyramidal minting, will shape and form the very structure of the organization or the organism that you're in, and will either form your long-term, eternal, mutually symbiotic kind of an organization or a parasitic one. And so I think as though John and my trajectory have been totally different, we end up being concerned with and interested in similar kinds of questions. And of course, the tools that we collectively as humanity have now, the ability to build nodal networks, the ability to build distributed ledgers, the ability to build autonomy not connected to particular geographies, all of these things now prepare us as humans to now engage in truly new kinds of social or organic forms that are sustaining of life as opposed to destructive of life. You're muted, John.
Thank you, Bill. One thing I'd like to highlight for subsequent clarification is this question of actually flows and capture. And I think this ties into the whole broader conversation of autonomy, of what is true autonomy and not, and how to maintain autonomy on a principled basis. And I think we can come back to that. But to that point, I think now John Havens and the kind of work that you've been doing in the IEEE and providing an ethical perspective, I think is ripe ripe for conversation right now. So get your perspective on this as well.
Well, first of all, just want to say thank you, John, and thank you to all the speakers so far. I have so much to learn. So I will have some technical things that I'm sure are not either correct or as informed as I look forward to them being. I will say I'm not speaking for IEEE, but I have a lot of great experience working at IEEE the last about 10 years. And I wrote a book in 2014 that I'll start with. It was before IEEE. It's called Hacking Happiness: Why Our Personal Data Counts and How Tracking It Can Change the World. And before I talk about AI, one thing on this call, and I've said for years, IEEE, we got to work with the OECD to help inform their AI principles in 2017 in the EU Commission. And we always recommended using the phrase AI systems because the word systems infers a couple things. One is there's not just one type of AI, as I think we'd all agree. There's deep learning, inverse reinforcement learning, and now active inference. And also all the systems use data. And where they use human data, I think one of the biggest opportunities and things I'm most joyfully excited about is what happens, and this is where I might be wrong, so enjoy, about aspects of active inference, but as agency. I'm 55. One thing I work a lot in is it's a law called age-appropriate design that came out of the United Kingdom with Baroness Beeben Kidron from the House of Lords. There's a lot of research. I think it's age 22 or so. People under a certain age globally, but also I'm going to talk more about what I mean by globally, because in general, and this is not pejorative, but I think most of the thoughts on the call today are probably coming from a Western rationalist dualism kind of philosophical background. That's not wrong or bad. It's just something I learned at IEEE. We had this big document called Ethically Aligned Design that I helped shape. And the first version of it that came out in 2016 with about 100 thought leaders from the UK, North America, and Europe. They were all Western. We didn't choose that. It just happened. We all spoke English and we're Western. And we got 500 pages of feedback on that document, almost half of which, and I read all 500 pages, that was part of my role, was people saying this is a great document, but you don't have any non-Western or global majority viewpoints on how applied ethics works. Because the term ethics, if you use that as I have for years, lawyers interpret ethics as compliance. In the corporate world, I was an EVP of a top 10 PR firm. A lot of times it goes to HR and moves to DEI discussions. Applied ethics, and the name of our document is called Ethically Aligned Design. And the logic was at the design phase, how can the people making the technology or framing the data governance have an ethically aligned orientation so they are accountable to people and to planet? Anyway, when we got this feedback in 2016, it was just a joy because we heard from people from Japan and China and Thailand and Mexico. And we created a chapter I'm very proud of, I didn't write it, called Classical Ethics and AI. And it talks about Confucian perspectives and Shinto perspectives, and especially Ubuntu ethics, which you all have probably heard of. And along with utilitarianism, deontological ethics, virtue ethics is really hard. And here's why. Because in general, it means you have to act on your beliefs in such a way that you need to be, by definition, from an Ubuntu ethics perspective, relational. And so here's what I guess I'm most excited about the potential for when we've had great talks, John and I, about active inference, is in my work in positive psychology and working with sociologists for years. And in the spiritual realm, I went to college thinking I was going to be a minister. I recently joined a wonderful body of experts called AI and Faith that started in Seattle. It's not just Christianity or Judaism, it's Islam, it's people who are agnostic. But they discuss issues like we're discussing today with what I will call, in my experience, of relationality. I'm also a musician, I'm a writer, so an artist, is that there is a space between two people and a space between a person and nature, which I will use certain terms. I wouldn't want to use the terms for all of you, but I will recommend another great thinker in the space, the AI and tech space, who you may not think of as a great thinker in the space, and that's Pope Francis. If you haven't read his 2015 encyclical, it just means a document from a pope, called Laudato Si, Our Common Home. It's this beautiful treatise about saying, what if the planet, and I think it is actually written more for Westerners than indigenous folks, and I use the term folks because that's what indigenous friends have mentioned to me, who, by the way, if we don't talk about, again, about personal data, indigenous data sovereignty, I have the honor to work with a few indigenous thought leaders and a number of people in their communities who are kind of reminding the world that whatever systems are built, in their case, where they have sovereignty over their data, they have sovereignty over their languages, and the cultural artifacts that they deem the most precious part of who they are as a people. And I talk to them a lot and I say, isn't that to a certain degree, and again, thank you, because it's very different in lots of other ways, isn't that what we all need, especially children? A sense of sovereignty around our data, so that as kids, especially under age 22, who have never experienced a world without the internet and all these other tools, it's very easy, I see in my communities, engineers and others, to sort of make assumptions that kids understand what it was like to have a world without these tools. But the name agency, that whole study of human-computer interaction and agency, is really something that now has to be taught and protected. And age-appropriate design, as I mentioned, IEEE, we have a standard called 7012 that I think active inference would be a great addition for. It's about giving people their own personal terms and conditions. But ultimately, and I want to honor our time here, the last thing I'll end on is sort of a question, which I've been asking for years in my work in the economic realm. I just came back from Rome last week. OECD had their 7th International Symposium on Well-being. Well-being is not about wellness. It's about the economic metrics beyond or over and above. The term is GDP and beyond, where this is a question I'll ask for this community because I'm asking it anywhere. With any of our efforts in AI, active inference or anything else, large language models, are we tacitly or overtly accepting the message that essentially started with Bretton Woods, which says we say that success is defined largely, if not holistically, in either exponential growth or growth, and thank you, Matthew, for mentioning the Club of Rome, Danilo Meadows, etc., and measured by fiscal metrics in isolation or first, where shareholder value, this is not wrong or immoral or ethical. It's a question of systems design. Because part A is what we have right now, a global system, especially of finance, that if we want things to work for 8 billion people and the planet in our Anthropocenic era, it's not going to happen. There it is. Meaning, in terms of AI, I've worked in this field for 10 years. The irony of saying we're going to use AI in any way to save the planet, while the large language models use so much water, especially in drought-ridden areas. And I'm in New Jersey, where yesterday I just got old-fashioned phone calls. Wildfires are at 1,300%, 1,300% in New Jersey right now in droughts than they ever have been before because of climate change. And I'll give a couple of solutions, especially heroes of mine. I'll mention, ironically, also in the Vatican yesterday, Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados. If you don't know her name, get to know her name. She single-handedly may literally save the planet. Because working with Mariana Mazzucato, a very well-known economist, has basically pointed out that our financial systems, things as boring sounding, but actually fundamental to saving the planet, literally the ecosystems, the biodiversity of companies, not because they're evil, right? That's not the point, or unethical. The system says companies, corporations can put X amount of money in terms of taxes, right? What Prime Minister Motley pointed out years ago, God bless her and her courage, was she went to the IMF and said, I'm in Barbados. I live in the equatorial zone where the climate emergency is not about mitigation, adaptation, and having the time to think about, let's do whatever and talk about our net zero strategies for 2030 or 2050. Right now, my citizens are in a state of chaos. The first third of my budget goes to debt from the countries causing majority of pollution. You guys, the people that created developed versus developing nations. And she had this brilliant and of kindness, but an authority to say, if you can shift how these taxation systems are done, then my country can eventually pay back some of the debt, but also you have to create what's called the loss and damage fund, if you watched any of the recent COP situations. Anyway, all this is to say, my final point here is, what I've been working for years is to say the actual solution for society that we can measure by multiple metrics is prioritizing ecosystem and human flourishing. And what Pope Francis talks about is an integrated ecology, where it's a person feeling they have worth, so they're able to connect with others and care, and then understanding nature, biodiversity, so there's a symbiosis of those systems. But the priority is in caregiving, not competition. And I can go into more depth about, Adam Smith and Charles Darwin and convivialism and aspects of so many people around the world saying caregiving is how we actually save the planet and each other moving forward.
Thank you, John. Well, I think there are a lot of topics here, and I don't that we threads we can pursue. One that maybe I'd throw out, I think that the recognition is that we're moving from a notion of prosperity and social organization that were really taken from a sort of Newtonian mechanical view of the world, in which it was not a living thing, it was an object. It was an object to be extracted and used, and they've created a lot of wealth, but we didn't have a sense of the limitation that as living things, there's interdependencies. Hence, we created massive sort of fungibility of things. And this is to the point that Bill was making, in the sense that the biosphere is fungible. There's no one thing that actually is that you're trying to preserve to keep alive. It doesn't incentivize that, and so we're moving into a different kind of economy, and I think a different notion of from a mechanical to a biological notion of social organization. I'd be interested in getting people's reactions to that. And I say I'm a bias because I really am very convinced that the active inference free energy principle hits a lot of the criteria that we want. And I think it's based upon fundamental principles and that is scalable. But I do think that we're moving that transition. But what happens when you actually have agency into autonomous things, and that creates a new kind of social contract? And then who owns the value that's created by that? Is that going to be captured by current corporations? Is that going to be captured? And I think that the social contract is extremely important because I think there's a new social contract that comes out of that. We can't do it within the current context, and we don't have the means by. I think there's an avenue to do that, but I think currently within the current framework, it will not get captured except by those that own the technology right now. And the other point I'd like to pick up with John that you mentioned, I think it's really important. As you know, I've been involved in the whole idea of data sovereignty, personal data for literally 20 years. And it really hasn't moved. I mean, and I think it's not just much people are going to have sovereignty over their data. They're going to have their own agents. They're going to have their own manifestation of who they are that's going to be derived from their agent. And if they don't have control over that, and if that's not a surveillance system, there's not a strong way of protecting that. And we do have the technology to do that, zero knowledge proof. The technology is there, but if that doesn't happen, then that is a nightmare. I mean, and Harari talks about this in his book, The Nexus, is sort of the next degree of surveillance that's possible because the data is out there. So there really has to be a new way of not only just talking about, but implementing architectures that actually secure that. And I think if we're going to create agents or just ravaging and extracting data, extracting value, and concentrating. That is the nightmare. Therefore, there's a new kind of, technology architecture is policy. I mean, and so but you don't have a lot of policymakers that understand technology architectures, and then you have a lot of stuff that's being sold as solutions that are really not. They're pretty empty in my view. If you really look at decentralized autonomous, or they're not decentralized. This whole idea of capture is absolutely critical. Can you have a method of non-capturable decentralization? And I think I think there are avenues to do that. I think there are principal ways of doing that, but that is a new kind of agenda. So I'll throw that out there to see. And Andrew, you seem to be.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I think this is really important. It connects, I think, productively to what I was trying to say about what's the system in which this system is deployed. And it raises for me the enduring value of observation that Tim O'Reilly has made many times, asking the question, so what's the master algorithm, right? And that connects to Danella Meadows' work about place to intervene in a system. Because what Tim's asking us to pay attention to is what's the purpose of the system in which this is deployed. And if you can change the purpose, a lot of things then flow. But if you can't change the purpose, it's the novel entry that becomes distorted or deformed. So I think being aware that as powerful as these technologies are, they get deployed in systems that will then shape use and evolution. And if we don't get a handle, which I hear as one of the through lines of our conversation today, if we don't get a handle on what is the organizing principle in the kind of overarching system or underlying system that these technologies are deployed into, we will see results that will surprise us and probably disappoint us.
Yeah, Bill.
So I liked John's comment that caregiving is sort of where we need to start with. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, that takes my mind right down to a deeper exploration and understanding of a sort of a Markovian blanket enclosed space. In other words, life is, from my understanding, arises from these very beginnings, these tiny, tiny beginnings, and then find their way to more complexity. And it's the overreaching of some life forms that then try to extract their unfair due from other life forms without sort of generating their own value. And that's where we get the parasitic behavior. So the question is then, how do you model or how do you think about a Markovian space in an economic system? And I would say in order to do that, you have to have a form of currency that each Markovian space is that mints. In other words, we have to get distributed minting. And so each Markovian space is a mint, has its own currency, and is able to exchange that currency more or less at free will. And that minting is not attackable. by outside forces. Certainly, it's attackable by stupidity of the Markovian space. That's its own problem. But in general, and that goes back then to dealing with things like the technologies, like the people at WorldCoin are trying to play with, where you have an authentication, a proof of provenance. John was just speaking to VK, the zero knowledge ZK proofs. This is a way to bring the authentication, the provenance at a low cost, at a high speed, down to where you can have a more or less tiny conceptual life form to be authenticated in whatever chain of provenance you want to have. And so the new life forms, the new economic life forms, have to be grown from bottom up. And certainly the nodal networks that we know from the analogy of the internet is a good analogy to start. But I think we have to go beyond that because we somewhat, in our analogies of the nodal networks looking at the internet, we assume that those are somewhat static or passive. And all life forms are not static or passive. They are all trying to carve out their own space in their own ecosystem. And so then we have to, well, maybe that's far enough with that analogy at the moment, but if we look at these Markovian spaces as emergent life forms, and we have to give them the forms of value exchange through these new tools, then we can build a new system. You're on mute, John.
Matt.
I love the talk of new systems, but I just want to frame something in the context of what I've observed in interacting with the environmental and finance movement, right? Because I work in sustainable finance, so the finance people think I'm a hippie, right? And the hippies think I'm a evil capitalist, right? And what I've observed a lot of the time is that you have basically two camps of thought. You have people who are trying to practically implement what they can, like on Tuesday, right? And then you have people who are like, this will never work. Everything's going to collapse. We need a brand new system, new Bretton Woods, whatever, new currencies. I love both of these conversations, but I see a lot of conflict and, let's say, purgatory because we're talking past each other from those two different islands. And so when I think about something like the emergence of life from Markovian blankets and spaces, right? Okay, now I get all excited. Star Trek future, no money. We all just explore and farm and make art. Fantastic. But when I look at the 12 like places to intervene in the system, I could put another column next to that and be like, where could you, like, if you applied these, agentic AI at each step, some are possible to do right now. Some are not at those different scales. So to me, what is a very interesting question is practically how do we implement the jump towards this future state amongst what is actually possible to do? Andrew is on the line. I mean, Andrew's work on these bioform packages in Python, amazing. Amazing. Everyone should clone the repos and look at it and watch the code stream. Fantastic. Okay. But like if we were going to deploy these next week, like, what do we do? Do I go to IKEA Foundation and be like, hey, give us $1 million. We'll make free energy tokens and apply it on this biofarm. And here are the 8 different activities the agents can do. Like, so for me, I would love some thoughts on this balance between, what we can do right now on Tuesday and what will take longer and how do we actually build towards this with this notion of value capture and the actual things we all have different hands on different levers, right? And there's the micro transactions and the macro global economic policy. We're not getting a wealth tax. We're not going to get rid of the dollar. We're not going to get rid of the renminbi. This is all going to happen. There's still that step function. I don't see the connection, and I'd love any thoughts people have on that balance between immediate implementation and, let's say, the quantum tunnel to this new system.
John, I want to honor your question, but I just want to respond to Matt a little bit. I mean, there's a deeper conversation, a longer conversation, but I do think that there is a way to bootstrap this thing up very quickly, and I think that what is unique about these circumstances is the level of automation and scaling that can take place, and you can actually create a more efficient and value creating network this way. I think it outcompetes the current system. You've got to get it working, and And Bill, I think there are ways of dealing with the currency. Each agent, there's a lot of design considerations, and we can't go into detail here, but I think do lend themselves. So there are people that are interested in that. And I also think there are very principled ways of how governing the issue of tokens and or of currencies. And this came out of actually one of the conversations with that was on the one of the streams here. And Matt Brown is talking about and ThoughtForge about actually how do you create law of requisite variety in homeostatic networks that self-regulate themselves when you have multiple kinds of messaging. So there, I really think there's a science and technology basis for doing this. I mean, and so I don't want to be overly optimistic, and I think. And the other question is, if you create these resilient networks that actually function better, then you have a classic currency that's a hedge against or an offset against the current. And I think that there's so much risk that's built into the currency system that yet a new kind of nature-based asset class will outcompete that in some point. And that's where and so how do we do that? And how do we get that going? And how do we bootstrap that? So I'm sorry to introduce myself, but John, the floor is yours.
Well, I just want to say I love what you said, Matt, and I know what you mean, those two worlds, like hippie, capitalist, maybe capitalist. Maybe we can coin that term, I guess. But a couple things I've found have been interesting and useful, at least for me, is to go to different policy meetings like the OECD. And maybe it's because I was an actor for years and I'm a musician. A lot of times there's the storytelling part of the framing of how we are presented information that doesn't change. And yet innovation-wise, and I love Bill and others' comments on business. I'm a big reader of like Peter Drucker, et cetera. There are people like Paul Pullman, if you haven't read the book Net Positive. He, for the past 10 years, or when he was still at Unilever, provided increasing value using competitive means per se, but it wasn't competition like traditional neoliberal economics, which another thought leader, Kate Raworth, is doing. Kate Raworth, if you don't know her, Raworth, her work with donut economics, she is actually changing systems in the current systems. She's showing people how, with planetary boundaries issues, working with the entire community of the different places she's working, she's changing how economics is done, pointing out that, again, traditional neoliberal economics is really, it's a story, right? She eviscerates it in the first chapter of her book in a much more interesting way than I say it's a story. But she points out that scarcity, et cetera, in one sense, yes, we all are focused on ourselves. And it's easy to go to Adam Smith's Invisible Hand and ignore his book on theory of moral sentiments. It's easy to go to Darwin and look at certain theories and not his later writings when he talked about symbiosis and that the actual idea, again, I'm quoting Darwin, not, whatever. And caregiving, here's the thing, I'll just say it for me. In my work, especially with ministry-oriented things, my dad was a psychiatrist, and now I want to talk about the reality of being an American right now as I sit here in New Jersey. I was in Rome when Trump was announced as president, and what I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt was half of our country was going to be in mourning and grief. And our U.S. Not chief medical officer, I always forget his title, Dr. It's not Vivek Ramaswamy. It's anyway.
In general?
Yes, our Surgeon General said we're in an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and there's physiological metrics showing what that means. It actually means that people literally are dying 1 to 2 to 3 years earlier because of the ramifications of isolation. Now, I bring this up because the metrics that we don't look at still exist. Biodiversity and measures of water and aquifer depletion, which the New York Times talked about 2 years ago, in graphic, devastating logic. And then also things like, one thing with John and I, we have great conversations. John, if you haven't read some of his different work on, like, John, your mind is incredible, and I always benefit from your mind and your heart, is things like in Phoenix, Arizona, the reinsurance industry won't insure anymore because of the lack of water. So I find it interesting when we frame conversations about AI risk and safety, in my experience in the past 10 years at the OECD, at NIST, at whatever body, where usually the environment is like 7th on the list. And there's a term called strong sustainability, which is not about climate change or denial. It's just physics. It's saying how much water is available in a certain area. And people don't recognize aquifers take 16,000 years to replenish naturally. The fact that water used to be able to fill it up doesn't mean it still will when there's so many people taking water from one place. And I bring this up because at the top of design, and I'll just say this again as a opportunity, is where you say we want to prioritize. And this is my experience working with over 800 thought leaders with AI work. The 800 people said the top things we want to focus on for our AI principles. Number one, human and environmental rights. Now, legally, those are hard to understand, but if you include indigenous rights as well, all that means is what a beautiful opportunity for innovation at the outset of design to say, we're about to build this system. Do we know how it's going to improve human flourishing and improve biodiversity, et cetera? Where someone goes, no, we don't know. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It means what a great opportunity for innovation. But then if they find out, hey, it turns out we're going to use so much water using the AI that we thought was going to help with the environment, maybe we should shift how we build it. That's not saying no, that's not a ban, but it is an opportunity to say, if we're building a data center in Chile, which Microsoft did in a drought-ridden place, then the given is it's 2 or 3 years of extraction, and there it is. That means the business model that Microsoft has to work within is still shareholder value and growth, which is not prioritizing people and planet first. So caregiving is actually what I've tried to get to beyond an anger about the systems, the Bretton Woods that exist, is the storytelling, showing people, do you know what it's like to be in nature? Do you know what it's like to be in symbiosis with other people and lead with love? It's really hard, but it's innovation that's, I think, the only way we move forward safely.
Susanna.
Just wanted to pose a question about your thoughts on a rights of nature-based economic system, where, as we're talking about these new social contracts, posing the possibility of integrating nature on our board, as a stakeholder in a company, which then, allows animal species, plant species, our waterways, our mountains, et cetera, to be active participants in our economy and receive the value generated from our economic activities to further steward, protect, regenerate that particular species, and how we can use artificial intelligence, active inference modeling to identify the benefit or the value of these different actors in the activities and in the outcome of.
There's a new platform called Tahano. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was started by Jonathan Lagarde, and we're basically it's in Rwanda, but it's in Africa, and what they're doing is giving agency to different species, and Rwanda government is supporting on this, and give agency to a river as a living thing, and as that has rights, but it also has a currency that it actually has its own currency and wallets, and they're doing this experiments of doing that. I think this is the beginning of a new way of thinking about a relationship with nature. And again, I sound like a active inference fundamentalist, but it's like the real. It's like is a principle-based way of when you look at something and what is alive, and then give agency to it. And if you look at the fundamentals of Carl's work and others, or Michael Levitt and stuff, I mean, this is really a highly grounded way of looking at things that have agency. All forms of life have agency at different scales, and we are part of something. We're not it. And so I think, and that's part of the reality of being able to model that reality. It's just not virtue signaling. It's actually recognizing the reality of nature and physics and how the universe works.
Natural law, right?
It's fundamental. I think it's fundamental. And I think it has to be fundamental.
Mm-hmm. Bill?
So in nature modeling, we have the concept of, in times of chaos, we get this punctuated disequilibrium. In other words, you can get pretty rapid change in points at points of chaos. And as a amateur economist, I think that the world, due to its currency systems and so on, is going to go through a rather rapid rate of institutional collapse. And with this institutional collapse, it isn't a matter of should we or shouldn't we replace some of these old systems. We will be picking up the pieces from historical collapse, and we have no choice but pick up the pieces.
Right.
And fortunately, though, if we have the proper meme, or as you were mentioning, storytelling, if you have the proper story, the proper meme in your mind, and are able to ignore pretty much some of the historical institutions that seem to be more trouble causing than help, but then understand with the power of the new tools that we have, we can indeed have much more fully competitive change than we ever have assumed in the past. We'll have a foreshortening of a 10x or more of any rate of change than we've ever seen in historical times.
Well, and I'll just add, I mean, that period of punctuated disequilibrium, I mean, this is Thomas Kuhn, right? We're in this period of
Yes.
extraordinary change, right? We're having a debate about what the future of the monetary system should be and who gets to decide, like, and so the question to me is, how do you put the experts up there and actually force the debate, right? Because at a certain point, there is an agency problem. I mean, we can start one system, and we're in an age where the interface between predictive AI and quantitative AI, I'll say like active inference versus large language textual based AI, the connection between these two things, you know, when you start having agents go out and start discovering the stock market, to me, it's not inconceivable that some Renaissance funds or someone could make an agent that makes $1 trillion in a month, right? And then what happens to the system, right? That then, so for me, I'm always like, how do we actually force the debate for the paradigm shift to occur? Because we are in that period of extraordinary science where one paradigm will win out. The question is how and where, and what to what degree our respective works on these different portions of a bio-based firm, how could we actually implement this so that it does have a chance to tip before the other paradigms shift?
Okay.
As a entrepreneur, excuse me for my bias, who was it? Gandhi said, "Be the change you want." So I pretty much ignore the existing institutions other than to take whatever learning I want to, let them do whatever they want to do. And it's the entrepreneurs of the world of all levels using these tools that will create the change. To look to current major institutions for change is looking to the dinosaurs just before the meter hit.
Okay. We have a question from Dave Douglas. Do you want to talk? Yes.
We're going to need some really high quality people to rethink what's going on, to start thinking. And unfortunately, we are really losing high quality young people. To have a healthy child, it's necessary for a full-time caregiver. Makes no difference. Is it grandpa? Is it dad? Is it an aunt? Is it mother? It's usually been mother historically. Has to be. Alan Shore has explored the enormous amount of work that a child, an infant, takes to become a normal, healthy, productive, non-pathological adolescent and adult. When kids are thrown into daycare, you get exactly the opposite. You get ruined children. Now, what's the perspective that's missing? Well, people have mentioned the third party, the third person perspective. That this going back to Galileo was regarded as the only proper way to do science. One perspective and one perspective only. Well, even in grammar, you've got first person, second person, third person, and only the third person has been regarded as intellectually respectable. Now, I just picked up from Mark Solms not too long ago. He's trying to explain why you don't need dualism, ontological dualism. You can have a dual aspect dualism. Mark Solms is lying in bed, just waking up, eyes are closed, and slowly you realize, oh, I'm Mark. This is what I have to do this morning. This is what I'll be doing the rest of the day. Opens his eyes, comes over, looks at the mirror. There's another Mark Solms. Does he freak out? No, he knows perfectly well. This is the same me from a third person perspective. Well, what I haven't heard ever in my life is a discussion of the second person perspective, except from Martin Buber and some other religious thinkers, because the absolutely, and some writers of love poetry, the best love poetry, the absolute and open-ended embrace of I and thou really is the recapture of the Garden of Eden. That is the perfect relation, the difficult, struggling relation between the pre-verbal child and the mother. I suspect that one of the reasons that so many people spend so much time on chatbots is that it feels like it's a thou. It feels like I'm being experienced as a unique person, but it isn't true. Large language models know nothing, absolutely nothing. It's not a matter that they're not smart enough, or that their knowledge is incomplete, or that it's all verbal. Not so. They know absolutely nothing, and you cannot be known by something that knows nothing.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of intellectual work that needs to be constructed. If we go back to Dante or Augustine's prayers, why is it that in these very demanding works that he's trying to do on politics, Augustine over and over talks to God? Keep looking at the right thing. He doesn't. How can I maintain the third person without the second person? How can I maintain the first person without the second?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Simon, one of the things I want to have the conversation go back to some of the things we started out earlier in terms of what is a challenge to the current enterprises in terms of accommodating this, and that if you're going to do, you brought up the example of fully automating a company, and that you had one person running it, and if that is the avenue that you're going to have that radical transformation. So if you can have agents do things better than people, and they can learn faster than people, then really, what's the social contract in terms of employing people? And then who owns the benefit of the value that's created? Is it are we going to have a new kind of social contract? Is it? I mean, let me just put something we played with thinking about. You get a Y Combinator for agents. Is that I'm going to sort of, so why don't we just start? I'll start up a biofirm agent, and we'll spin up a company, and you can scale it and experiment with it, and it can suddenly create value. People have alluded to that and saying, "Oh, we have a trader agent," that Matt was talking about that. But I think there are many other forms of things that can be done that way. Yet on the positive side, you might be able to greatly simplify bureaucracies. You may actually have a much more effective form of administration and governance. I mean, one of the areas that we're looking at is in legal. We're doing a project of legal reasoning and say, hey, the difference between you have certain rights, but the enforcement of those rights are so expensive and so time consuming that they're never really effectively realized. But now, if you have an agent, you can actually say, I can have something that works on the behalf of people who can't afford a legal system. And so the distance between the declarations of right and enforcement of the rights becomes greatly reduced, and you have new criteria to apply to that. But I think that the notion that you can do this is just a matter of augmentation, I think is sort of running from the truth. Lift the veil, look behind, and say, where is this really going, and who's going to take advantage of that? What is it? There's going to be a whole nother group of people say, the hell with the traditional enterprise. We're gonna run with this thing, and we're gonna create value and accelerate this, and so How do you see that in terms of your clients and people? Unfortunately, Andrew had a little crisis, so he had to leave. So I'm landing this on you, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Some of the economists, people like Eric Brynjolfsson, who's been
I
at the
don't know.
leading edge of thinking about this, he will say that if you look at the jobs that exist today compared to 1940, a very large proportion of the jobs today didn't exist then.
Right.
So, technology always comes along, it replaces certain jobs, and then human ingenuity finds new jobs. Um, but I think this is something quite different. This is not just giving us the power of muscle, if you like, replacing human muscle with sort of machine muscle, because
Exactly.
it's changing, its intellect, isn't it? It's getting things done by communicating and sharing ideas. And so we talk about this again. Economists will, people like Eric will start to say, well, there's going to be this sort of disruption for a bit, and then it will pick up as we find new jobs. But a lot of the jobs that people do, knowledge workers, and I think something like 50% of industrial sectors are knowledge intensive. A lot of those jobs, the tasks are ones that could be replaced and done better by robots, unfortunately. So how much, people say, well, we're left then, or the humans can do the creative activity, the strategic activity. But how much creative and strategic activity is needed? And in the end, could
Right.
the bots, create judgment that is not much different than the humans? So, when there's a Eric also has got this great tool that sucks up all job descriptions in a company and analyze using an LLM trained on lots of jobs. And then it analyzes how many of those tasks that every individual does within every function, how much of those tasks could be automated or
Right.
augmented. And of course, if you're a nurse who's injecting, stuff into someone's arm, maybe that job doesn't get done by a robot, but a lot of his or her job is not that. It's more, let's call it knowledge work. And therefore, if once that's removed, what is the job of you only maybe need one nurse rather than 10 because you've
Okay.
collapsed what they need to do. So I think there's, I think the answer is I don't know. But this is, it's not there at scale yet, but we haven't really thought that through. And of course, some futurists say, well, we'll all be on universal benefits, and maybe we all just spend our time on an exercise bike, taking part in some virtual reality thing, but generating energy all day long and keeping fit in as a result. That's another way of generating. I don't know, vast armies of people doing
Okay.
that all day. So the answer is I don't know at all, but I think people talk about the or the one person company that can be worth $1 billion. That's potentially that's possible, but I don't know because it's very early days.
Okay. Very good. I mean, just to your one point, I'm also surprised by the extent to which the physical robots are getting very dexterous too. I mean, so giving the shot, the nurse may be doing that as well. I mean, that's happening pretty fast as well. So we're running out of time, but John, I'll let you could be this maybe the last one to launch us.
Sure, and thank you. And I know I was wrote a lot in the chat room too, so thanks for
Yeah.
letting me be verbose. But wow, just want to say thank you, John. And I've learned so much. And if I seem like I'm speaking with authority, it's usually with passion, and I can't wait to learn. So that's the main thing. I will say, since 2015, I've been in a lot of rooms talking about the future of work. I've met Eric a couple of times. He's undoubtedly incredibly smart. I will come from not a skeptical standpoint, a realist standpoint. As an American right now, and I used to be an actor, a professional Screen Actors Guild actor. Once you lose your job in the States, you don't have a job. So Eric and others who I've been with due respect, I often want to say to them, how often have you been without work or medical insurance?
Yeah.
because it becomes very different. And it's not that what he's saying isn't smart, but a guy named Martin Ford wrote a book called The Rise of the Robots in 2015. And he said something that was so helpful to me, which I'd leave here for this community, which he said, as long as GDP or financial metrics or exponential growth are the primary metric of success for society or for shareholders, every job that can be automated will be, period. And I think that's the case. And the idea that people will say, Eric or others included, these jobs are the same. I just want to double down. And by the way, Simon, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm actually doing a yes and, which is data. Data is a critical thing to remember. How our jobs are replacing us. My identity, my intellectual property as a Screen Actors Guild actor, I was part of a union that protected my data. OpenAI and others are like, give it to everybody. And so there's that. And then the final thing is, what do we actually know? And I put some links in there if this is useful. The narrative around AGI especially ultimately is people saying whatever their different, views are, AGI is the moment it replaces human skills at whatever. And then you phrase like better than. And what I would proffer is, first of all, I used to be an actor. I couldn't say if someone liked my performance. And even today, if I write music and any of you listen to the music and then you listen to music generated by AI, it is your determination to say whether you prefer it better. That's subjective. What is objective is to say, what is it society wants? How do we measure value? If it's going to be exponential growth, as was mentioned earlier, by Matthew, Club of Rome said it years ago, the Manellas couple, it's finite in nature. Caregiving, here's the part I'll end on. I'm so happy to think about how active inference could help someone have agency, communicate with trees, the mycelium networks that you mentioned before, the Wood Wide Web, and then to each other, but where that person's identity is protected because their data is sacred and it represents their spirit and it represents the opportunity for us to move forward, where all these conversations outside of work also say, are we just our intellect and our cognition? Or do we also have the spirit of relationality between us? The answer is yes. And that's also where these conversations sometimes about the future of work and whatever else. What is the ultimate metric of society, the success for society? If it's caregiving and prioritizing, flourishing, I'm in. Where we are right now, how we got to the Anthropocene, it's not going to carry us forward.
So anyone other comments here? The panel. Okay. Well, we got about 3 more minutes here.
Take us home, John.
What's that?
Take us home.
Well, I think that and that there is a pathway forward. I really do. And I think that we've talking a lot about technology. I think the science of what is intelligence and what it means alive and keep things alive is a form of caring. And I do think that there's a principled way of doing this. And Andrew Pasha, Andrew is the kind of work that he's doing on that on the biofirm and how to create a biofirm that is a homeostatic. It's in principle homeostatic. So it is based not on extraction. It's based upon a biomimetic homeostasis of being able to keep the balance between multiple things, relational. And it's something that's scalable. And I think and this is why I'm very excited about doing something in the whole bioregional finance areas, the early experiments of this. And I think one can do that. I think it's not terribly expensive. These models don't have to be computer intensive. They can run on a mobile phone. I mean, so I'm in this area, I'm very optimistic. I'm obviously concerned about when we're going through this transition. And we just you just see who the new cabinet is going to be. You talk about someone bent on disassembling the whole structure. How do we arrive to something new is going to be really important, and I think this time critical. So again, I thank everybody for their time. It was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I wish you well and flourish.
And nice work on the symposium, John. You can take a deep breath. It was a great success.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, guys. Thanks a lot.